Hello, good evening and welcome everybody. Welcome back to the Huntington Library and here to the Rothenberg Hall. Delighted to see so many of you here for the closing programme in the Huntington Research Division's series of public lectures in the humanities. My name is Steve Hindle, I'm Director of Research here, and it's my pleasant duty to be your host for this evening's Wark lecture in art history, to be delivered by Professor Ann Birmingham, Emeritus Professor of Art History at UC Santa Barbara. I'm particularly thrilled to welcome on your behalf Ann back to the Huntington, where she's not only conducted much of her own research, but also played a significant role in exhibition programming here over the years. It's especially fitting that the occasion of this talk is the recent opening of an exhibition which showcases the highlights of the Huntington collections of British art, which has been so central to Anne's thinking throughout her career. For those of you who haven't seen the exhibition, I would really encourage you to do so. Curated by Dr. Melinda McCurdy, who's here in the audience this evening, the Huntington's curator of British art, 100 Great British Drawings presents rarely seen treasures from the Huntington's collection, which is amongst the largest outside of the UK, with more than 12,000 works representing the great masters of the medium, ranging from William Blake through John Constable, Thomas Gainsborough, J.M.W. Turner, and on to the contributions of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and the early 20th century modernists. The show is premised on the view that drawing is the most spontaneous and intimate of art forms, revealing the thoughts and mood of the artist through the stroke of a pen or the touch of a brush dipped in watercolor. It's difficult to imagine, I think, a scholar who is better qualified to elaborate on the themes of Melinda's exhibition than Ann Birmingham. Ann is the author of Landscape and Ideology, the English Rustic Tradition, 1760 to 1860, a hugely influential book in its field, and of Learning to Draw, Studies in the Cultural History of a Polite and Useful Art, which was awarded Best Book of 2000 by Historians of British Art and named by choice as one of the most outstanding academic titles for that year. She's also the editor of Sensation and Sensibility, Viewing Gainsborough's Cottage Door, which is actually the catalogue of my favourite Huntington exhibition, which I never actually got to see, but the fact that there's a catalogue really gives you the opportunity to revisit it. And with John Brewer of The Consumption of Culture, Image, Object, Text, 1600 to 1800. Ann's talk this evening interrogates drawing both as a technical manipulation of media and as an act of discovery for both the artist and the viewer. By examining the materials and techniques of drawing and their role in the creative process, she'll suggest that the medium, whether pencil, watercolor, ink, or charcoal, is the message. To present the 2022 Wark Lecture in Art History, please welcome Professor Ann Birmingham.
Steve, thank you so much for that very kind and generous introduction. And I also want to thank Melinda McCurdy for her invitation to me to write an essay for the catalog of Great British Drawings. And as Steve said, out of over 12,000 drawings in the Huntington collection, Melinda chose 100 examples that display the extraordinary depth and range of the collection. And her superb choice of drawings and her research on them significantly adds to the important scholarly work of past curators Bob Wark and Shelley Bennett. And I also just want to acknowledge the Gabriel Leno Tongva and the Kiza people, whose land is the place where the Huntington now stands, and whose ancestors inhabited this territory for over 2,000 years before the arrival of Europeans, and who still call this place home. Now, since I wrote the catalog essay, I've reflected, and I've had time to do this for a while now, reflected on the importance of media to the historical development of British drawings. And it's that story I'd like to tell tonight. In doing this, I'll be presenting a rough chronological survey of technical developments in the history of British drawing. And these have to do with advances in materials like paper, drafting media like pencils, and of course, with watercolor. I also want to try and give some sense of how drawing techniques responded over time to these material developments. As I hope to show, drawing is a process of visual thinking, and, as Steve said, an art of discovery. And it's true both for the artist who creates the drawing, and if you've done this yourself, you know that in the process of drawing, you also begin to develop a sense of really what your subject is. You begin to discover your subject. And I think it's also a process of discovery for the viewer who can see in that drawing traces of how it has been produced. And while oil painting, sculpture, and architecture present us with results that largely obscure the means through which they were obtained, drawing invites the viewer to observe the artist's process, the way in which the artist produced the image. And this is what I mean when I say, in drawing, the medium is the message. It all starts with paper. With one exception, all the drawings on exhibition are works on paper. The art of drawing only starts in the West in the early 15th century with the widespread manufacture and use of paper in Europe. Before the introduction of paper, artists drew on prepared animal skins called vellum, or on slate, plaster, or basically any other surface they could find that would allow them to record an image. Drawing was not the only pictorial medium to start in the 15th century. Oil painting, printmaking also began. This is a media revolution, and it's not unlike the media revolution we're experiencing with the digital, in the digital age. This media revolution is one of the reasons why the Renaissance is such a tremendous turning point in the history of Western art. Mastering these new artistic media and exploring what they were capable of producing is one of the fascinating challenges Renaissance artists took on. And some of the greatest of them, like Albert Dürer, were capable of excellence in all three. Paper allowed artists, for the first time really, to refine their compositions and their drafting techniques. For the first time in Western art, becoming an artist meant becoming adept at drawing. The most distinguished painters, sculptors, and architects were also the greatest draftspeople. By the beginning of the 16th century, drawing was seen to be the foundation for all of the arts. As this suggests, early drawings were usually preparatory in nature, as we see in this extraordinary drawing on the left by Jan van Eyck for an oil-painted portrait of an old man. The paper in this case was treated with chalk or clay ground that would record the delicate mark of the silver point that he used. Gradually, as more and more artists turned to drawing to improve their rendering techniques, drawing became valued as examples of their individual styles. And by the end of the 16th century, artists began to collect examples of exceptional drawings, like those of Van Eyck and Leonardo and Michelangelo, in order to copy and learn from them. As a result, by the end of the 16th century, drawing came to be valued as an art in itself, not just as a preparatory medium. So why did Van Eyck, Leonardo, draw on metal point, and Bramante with ink, and Michelangelo with chalk? Well, perhaps because pencils did not yet exist. The mining of graphite did not begin until the late 16th century, and its use by artists only became widespread in the 18th century. And I should just say, as an aside, graphite is not lead. It's a crystalline form of carbon, and today's lead pencils are in fact made with graphite. Now, luckily for British artists, the purest graphite in the world originated in the northern English valley of Borrowdale. Well suited for drawing, this soft, high-quality material was cut into sticks and either wrapped with twine for grasping between the fingers or placed in a porte crayon, a tool originally designed to hold a piece of chalk or charcoal. And it's that you see Johann Zoffany in this portrait, which is thought to be maybe a self-portrait. That's the tool that he's holding. It's a porte crayon. However, and the advantage of graphite was that it was a more permanent medium than chalk or charcoal. It didn't easily smudge, and it could hold a point. Unlike ink, graphite allowed for corrections. And like chalk, charcoal, and ink, graphite could also produce a wide range of tones, either through hatching or shading. It was the perfect medium for drawing. And you see an example of a graphite drawing here by Thomas Gainsborough, who was a remarkable innovator in all drawing media, and you'll see two examples of that in the exhibition. But this is a drawing from the 1740s when he's just beginning as a young artist, and it's at that moment also when graphite is really being used by artists sort of for the first time in a serious way. And so he's, as a kind of an artist always interested in new media, he's drawing as a young man in graphite. And we see it, in this drawing of a couple strolling in a landscape. Now, by the end of the 18th century, graphite pencils, both wooden and mechanical, were made in Britain. And by the early 19th century, they were being regularly used by British artists like John Constable. Constable's graphite drawing of Borrowdale, the very place where graphite was mined, demonstrates the wonderful range of tone the medium could produce. Dark shadows in the middle ground contrast sharply with the patch of a sunlit field. Graphite was Constable's preferred drawing medium. I believe this has to do with his lifelong concern with natural light, whether in drawing or in painting. And in this drawing of his family's parish church, the emphasis on light has an iconographic resonance in that we observe the church's sundial, this little thing, marking time over the churchyard. Now, the earliest examples of graphite drawing in the exhibition are botanical studies. In his study of nectarines, the renowned botanical draftsman Georg Erhard first drew the fruit in graphite before filling in the outlines with watercolor. Evidence of what his drawing style looked like can be seen in the faint traces of the leaves and the branching stems above the watercolor. And drawing in this case, as you can see, plays a secondary role to painting. The graphite contour drawing creates an empty form to be filled in with watercolor. It suggests the curling, serrated edges of the leaves and their placement, but nothing more. Matilda Conyers' study of wallflowers and a tulip is the only drawing in the show not produced on paper, but instead on vellum, which was that material that was used in the Middle Ages, which was made from animal skins. Unlike paper, vellum was the traditional support for botanical studies. Its polished, smooth surface ensured a sharp, exact outline. Despite this difference in support, Conyers, who was probably a student of Erhart's, follows his method of image making. Like Erhart, she uses watercolor to obscure any trace of the graphite outline of the flowers with which she started. And botanical studies, and not just these, depend on color for the purpose of identification. Erhart's note in graphite, what you see here, Roman red, identifies the type of nectarine he's depicting and explains its lush, rich color. As these examples show, graphite was a particularly suitable medium for exacting botanical studies in that its fine, pale contour could be easily corrected before it was made to totally disappear. As the favorite drawing medium, not just for botanical artists, but for most watercolor artists, it's not an exaggeration really to say that without graphite and paper, there would be no great British watercolor drawings. Graphite pencils were portable. Well, until the late 18th century, watercolor was not. 18th century watercolorists made paints themselves using finely ground pigments purchased from an apothecary or colorman. which they then mix with gum arabic or some other binder. The finished paints were often kept in small bowls or even seashells. And Paul Sandby's drawing at Yale of a young woman copying a drawing using a port crayon depicts several such pigment-filled shells on the table, right here. The earliest prepared commercial paints were small blocks of pigment that had to be laboriously scrubbed in water to obtain any color at all. That all changes in the 1780s, however, when William and Thomas Reeves developed a semi-moist watercolor cake that became immediately soluble when touched with water, making watercolor much less painstaking medium. Cakes were followed in the mid-19th century by pigment in tubes, a development finally perfected in the 1870s. While watercolor became easier to use, it was never as forgiving as oil paint. Errors could not be easily concealed, and the counterintuitive necessity of working from light to dark remained a challenge. Portability was also an issue. While numerous watercolor artists painted landscapes, they rarely painted them out of doors. Many watercolor artists, like John Robert Cousins, sketched their landscapes out of doors in graphite and then painted the effects inside, where it was easier to control the light, the moisture of the paper and the washes, and the constant need for a flat surface and clean water. The Huntington's watercolor by Cousins of the coast of Vietri from Salerno was most likely painted on the artist's return to London in 1783. The Huntington watercolor was based on this graphite drawing at Yale, which was made on the spot on September 22nd, 1782, and we can see that inscribed in Cousins' handwriting at the top left of the drawing. The drawing is a record of the view so that it could be recalled later. On it, we find these notes that would be important eventually for the watercolor rendition. And they're written here on the mountains, which say wood and rock. And then up in the sky here, he describes illuminated vapor on the upper part of the highest mountain. So the watercolor adheres closely to the Yale drawing. The drawing is squared for transfer. And Cousins, let me just show you this so it seems side by side, it might be better. Cousins segmented the composition of the drawing into boxes. And to produce the watercolor, he took a second, larger piece of paper and using a soft graphite line, segmented it into the same number of boxes. And then he proceeded to fill in with the matching portion of the image from the original drawing. The segmented boxes on the watercolor sheet could then be erased. And working from light to dark and from top to bottom, he applied his soft washes of blue, gray, and green, reserving white areas of the paper to suggest clouds, or what he had described as illuminated vapor, and to highlight the horizon, the distant mountains, and the surf. And so you see these little touches of white, all throughout, and even a little group of sheep over here on the side of the hill. The last things to be painted were the darker areas, the wood and rocks on the blue mountains in the middle distance, the green shadows in the foreground, and the darker details of the trees and the grapevines in the foreground. And these are grapevines being tended by someone. The point of Cousins' original graphite drawing was not just to provide a visual record of the scene, but to create a template, not just for the Huntington watercolor, but for others as well, such as this one in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and that's the one on the right. And I should just say, if you don't see in the captions any identification about where the drawing is, that means it's here, it's in the collection, and it's in the exhibition. But the Oxford drawing is not, and that's why I put that there. The pencil drawing could spawn numerous watercolors, each one slightly different in its painterly and coloristic effects. Moreover, the preparatory graphite line could all but be erased, making it appear that the watercolor was an original impression of the view. While the paper in the Huntington's version is yellowed, thus obscuring the full range of tonal effects, you can see significant differences between it and the Oxford version. When compared, the Oxford watercolor lacks the complex aerial effects that we see in the sky in the Huntington version. It also doesn't have the care with which the details of the foliage and the mountain terrain are depicted. And what do I mean by that? Well, you know, if you look at it, it's not as highlighted, it's not as delicately drawn, the contours aren't as delicately drawn as what we see in the cousins. It seems like a more generalized take on the view, one that depends for its effects on a more simplified massing of tones and colors. And the laws of entropy suggest, at least to me, that the Oxford version was painted after the Huntington view. As the example of cousins shows, early watercolor practice was deeply entwined with drafting and with the multiplication of the image for commercial purposes. Duplicate watercolors produced from pencil outlines were not uncommon, and Turner was especially prolific in this regard. As a compulsive draftsman and one particularly gifted in managing topographical perspective, Turner filled hundreds of sketchbooks with pencil drawings of landscape views that served as aide-memoire, as we see in this very slight, rapid sketch of the Rigi Mountain on Lake Lucerne. And we're seeing it actually from the back, but as you'll see when we look at these. From these pencil sketches, rough and ragged as they are, Turner worked up sample watercolor sketches to show to potential patrons in the hope of securing a commission for a highly finished version suitable for exhibition. In the case of his study of the Rigi, a view he returned to over and over, Turner used watercolor sketches to explore the view of the mountain in different lights, suggestive of different times of day. This is by no means to say that Turner was a naturalist. Turner was a colorist and not really interested in natural light effects. His depictions of the Rigi are theatrical takes on the power of color to transform a view, to enhance its emotional and visual impact. Unlike Constable, who believed in the power of natural light itself to evoke a sense of time, weather, and emotion, Turner bypassed natural light effects and went straight for visual drama. Turner's preferred medium was not really graphite, although there's a lot of graphite drawings, but actually watercolor. He drew most of his sketches in watercolor. And these things, he's left thousands of them. And they're called now color beginnings because sometimes they're just little, washes of pink or blue. Now, as a water-based medium, watercolor's soft liquid effects were particularly suitable to the depiction of the moist English weather and landscape. However, unfortunately for watercolor artists, the Royal Academy, always behind the curve when it came to innovations in painting, considered watercolor to be simply a hand-colored drawing, and, to make matters worse, viewed drawing in a utilitarian way as a preparatory medium and not as an artistic end in itself. To gain academic status, watercolor needed to achieve a distance from utility and commerce by being seen as pure painting. Watercolorists freed themselves from the Academy by establishing their own exhibiting societies. The first of these was the Society of Painters in Watercolors, established in 1804. And there you see an exhibition that the society held in 1808. And just remember the way these watercolors are framed and how they look almost like oil paintings, because we'll come back to that. While pure painting might be the academic ideal, it was not entirely practical, since watercolorists, like everyone else, had to make a living, and Turner, again, is particularly interesting in this regard. In addition to producing finished watercolors for sale and exhibition, Turner, like many professional watercolorists, worked for publishers. He produced the Huntington's luminous Beaumarais Castle Anglesey, for a print series on the picturesque views in England and Wales, which was published between 1825 and 1838. The liquid mists and delicate veils of color that you see in Turner's watercolor were painted to be engraved. And the variety of techniques engravers had to use to approximate Turner's evanescent effects are almost as complicated as the effects themselves. Turner was one of several virtuoso watercolorists at the start of the 19th century who experimented with the transparent watercolor technique. Transparent watercolor uses the white of the paper rather than a white pigment to create highlights and pastel color washes. One of the most spectacular examples of the transparent technique is Thomas Girton's White House, Chelsea, at the Tate. Over a faint graphite drawing, Girton laid in washes of pure color with a dry brush for the sky so that the color leaves white specks of paper bare, which suggests an airy, luminous atmosphere, while wetter strokes of color are used for the water to create a liquid impression. However, the greatest virtuosic effect is created by reserving the white of the paper to create the brilliant White House and its reflection in the Thames. Now, Turner's view of Ludlow Castle, which is in the show at the Huntington, created roughly at the same time, really, as Girton's White House, is an example of one of his early transparent watercolors. As you might expect, this view came from a graphite pencil sketch, in this case from a sketchbook dated to 1798. And there's the sketch. The 9 by 13 inch sketch has been partly worked up in watercolor to suggest a naturalistic sunlit view of the castle and the distant river valley and mountains. Its sparkling freshness is a striking contrast to the Huntington's large 21 by 30 inch hazy blue version of the same view. As Melinda McCurdy and Jessie Fontana Maisel observe in the exhibition catalog, the large Huntington version was probably intended to be seen as comparable to an oil painting. And think of the way those watercolors are framed and hung in the Society for Painters in Watercolor that we saw a minute ago. That's the kind of watercolor this was meant to be. Now, the blue cast of Turner's finished watercolor is reminiscent of John Robert Cousins, the blue tonality that we saw in his view a while back. And thus, Ludlow Castle strongly recalls Cousins. This also explains its pronounced artificiality, its attempt to distance the final work from any sense of immediacy and the naturalism of the sketch. The result is a poetic Cousins-like tonal essay in soft blues, grays, and ochres. Turner tended to avoid green. The paper has yellowed, so you have to imagine these colors against a bright white ground. It's elaborately worked up with layer upon layer of colored washes to create a tonal gradation from a dark foreground to a light distance. And all the things I've been saying about how, watercolor is an intimate medium and you can look at it closely and see the creative process. Turner makes that really hard. He is the one exception to that, I think. Now, the few highlights are produced by reserving the white of the paper, or sponging and scraping off the color and allowing the white of the paper to show through. The composition, with its clearly articulated tonal spatial zones, calls to mind the classical landscapes of the great 17th century French painter Claude Lorraine. So when you see this painting from that perspective, Ludlow Castle is a tremendously ambitious and learned watercolor for such a young artist. And yes, it was such a good composition, Turner couldn't resist making another version, this one an essay in golden tones. Now, transparent watercolor technique in many cases dispensed with much in the way of underdrawing. An exceptional example of this is a panorama by Peter de Wint, where washes of watercolor are laid on without a preliminary pencil sketch. Painted 20 to 40 years after Turner's Ludlow Castle, De Wint's landscape has the freshness and immediacy of touch that Ludlow Castle, in its calculated formality, suppresses. De Wint's watercolor makes no attempt to imitate the size or look of an oil painting. It's simply and directly a watercolor. The medium, in this case, performs its essential qualities of liquid transparency. De Wint may have been able to dispense with underdrawing because by this time watercolor was portable enough to allow artists to paint with it directly from nature. And I'm not sure if De Wint painted this watercolor outside, but he was one of the watercolor artists known on occasion to do this. So, the medium of watercolor depended on paper that was strong enough to withstand the moisture of the pigment, and also practices like sponging and scratching out of highlights that watercolor artists like Turner subjected it to. James Whatman's invention of wove paper in the 1750s replaced the use of laid paper, first by book publishers and then eventually by artists as well. And here you see Paul Sandby's wonderful watercolor that's at Yale, a drawing of Whatman's paper mill in Kent, and this is where the paper mill is. It's a distant view. Kent had been the center of papermaking in Britain since the late 16th century. Sandby's watercolor is, appropriately enough, painted on Whatman's wove paper. So what is wove paper? Well, it's produced on a very fine mesh screen, and it's wove paper, which you see here. It's being compared in the photograph to laid paper, which is this. So wove paper is produced on a fine wire mesh screen, and as a result, it's thicker and it lacks the wire lines of laid paper, this kind of thing, that we see in Gainsborough's drawing. You can see, especially in the areas, the darker areas, some of the wire lines that we see in the 1740 drawing. And by the late 18th century, other manufacturers followed Whatman's example and began producing papers that were thick and sturdy enough to satisfy the needs of watercolorists. A witness, just a little aside, a witness to Turner's watercolor method describes him, quote, saturating the paper by pouring on wet paint, and then he tore, scratched, and scrabbled at it in a kind of frenzy until the image emerged as if by magic with all its exquisite minutiae. And given his aggressive approach to watercolor, it's no surprise that Turner used Whatman papers throughout his career. Watercolorists also sought out special papers to gain qualities of absorption, color, and texture that suited their style. Thomas Girton chose paper normally used to wrap cartridges for firearms. David Cox painted on rough Scotch wrapping paper, while George Cattermole used the thick, absorbent blue paper that grocers rolled into cones to hold sugar. These individual choices became associated with particular artists, and soon papermakers began producing these papers commercially to accommodate other watercolorists, hoping to achieve the effects they envied in the work of masters. As this suggests, watercolor was becoming a popular medium for amateurs, as well as for professional artists. So much so that art supply shops like this one, Rudolf Ackermann's Repository of the Arts on the Strand in London, did a brisk business supplying amateur watercolorists with everything they might desire. As watercolor increased in popularity, it became the medium associated with British art and British artistic excellence. During the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, a stretch of roughly 22 years, the continent was largely closed off, and what had been an open exchange of ideas, images, and media between England and Europe, and especially France, ceased. This is the period that saw the explosion of drawings in graphite and in watercolor in Britain. And it's only after Waterloo in 1815, when artists were once again free to travel abroad, that we find continental artists like Eugène Delacroix using both graphite and watercolor. Delacroix was introduced to these media in the 1820s by his friend, the British artist Richard Parkes Bonington, who had moved to France in 1817. You see an example over here of Bonington's work. It's pretty characteristic of the kind of things he did. Delacroix called Bonington's watercolors sparkling jewels, and the medium appealed to him because of its luminous color. Unlike Bonington, who made finished watercolors, Delacroix preferred to use watercolor for studies. And in this case, you're looking at a rare early landscape made on his trip to England to study British art. And you'll notice that this watercolor is made without any graphite underdrawing. The exhibition has two splendid watercolors by another associate of Bonington's, Thomas Schotter Boys. Born in London, Boys moved to Paris in the early 1820s and soon became friends with Bonington, who introduced him to watercolor and helped him develop his technique. Like Bonington, he was drawn to port scenes, where the wide expanses of water, sky, and beach could be punctuated by the vertical rigging of ships. The delicate linear outline of the masts of the ships and the skyline of the distant city contrasts with the looser application of watercolor in the sky and the foreground. And this puddle-like application of watercolor becomes an attribute of the Bonington expats living in France, as we see in the later Boys drawing of a chateau near Brussels. And you really see it in the treatment of the trees. I mean, it's just very wet, and it has that little puddly feel to it. And that kind of loose, wet application joined with an attention to natural color and light was what so impressed Delacroix. And you also see Delacroix using that precisely in that little sketch that we saw a minute ago. Watercolors by contemporary British artists were also admired by British collectors. In part, this had to do with a nationalistic pride in the achievement of British watercolorists, which surpassed anything in the medium found on the continent. The critical attention paid to watercolor was such that by 1810, the fear among oil painters and their patrons was that watercolor might surpass oil painting in prestige. Collectors of oil painting were some of the most outspoken. Sir George Beaumont, a patron and mentor of John Constable, suggested that the popularity of watercolor had more to do with novelty than merit. Others went out of their way to tie the medium to women, and hence to amateurism. And you see a wonderful little watercolor drawing done by Cassandra, the sister of Jane Austen, and it's a drawing of their niece painting a watercolor. And the association of watercolor with women and amateurs proved fatal. Most early 19th century drawing manuals, such as the one you see on the screen, nearly always included a section on watercolor, and women were the primary targets of these publications. In his new drawing book of Light and Shadow, which is in the exhibition, it's a book from 1812, the stationer and publisher Rudolf Ackermann commended British women for, quote, the cultivation of the study of drawing in watercolors, claiming that their firsthand knowledge of the medium resulted in their patronage of, quote, the best artists. Ackermann's positioning of women as both amateur practitioners and connoisseurs was, of course, an appeal to women as consumers. Nevertheless, this kind of advertising had a corrosive influence. It deprofessionalized the medium by feminizing it, and it dragged it back into the commercial sphere from which it was struggling to escape. And Ackermann, in addition to having the shop, the Repository of the Arts on the Strand, also had a magazine called the Repository of the Arts, and these are fashion plates from the magazine showing one woman drawing and another woman holding a drawing book, probably purchased at Ackermann's. Now, moreover, given the limitations of the printing medium, there was no way for drawing manuals to demonstrate watercolor techniques. Their crude illustrations were really just printed in monochrome, then with unsubtle hand coloring added. And you see the unsubtle hand coloring right here. Now, while the transparent technique dominated watercolor practice in the first quarter of the 19th century, by the 1830s, artists were increasingly experimenting with other media and techniques. John Martin, the painter of sensationalistic biblical scenes, preferred ink to pencil in his expressionistic drawings. The near absence of color and the fluid ink lines and washes in both his depiction of the seventh plague of Egypt and the enchanted castle create the dark, moody atmosphere he was famous for. They also announce Martin's indifference to naturalism, and instead his preoccupation with interior states of emotion and imagination. David Wilkie's brilliant figure drawings are primarily studies for his oil paintings of historical scenes. And Melinda McCurdy's entries in the catalog provide excellent commentary on the two Wilkie drawings in the exhibition. And as she explains, this drawing is not a preparatory sketch for a history painting, but it is a portrait study. And in it we see Wilkie using the trois crayons technique of drawing, employing black chalk for the overall drawing of the figure and to create shadows, with red chalk used to indicate flesh tones and occasional decorative bits of costume, and then white chalk for highlights. The buff tone of the paper provides a middle tone against which these colored chalks suggest shadows and highlights. This particularly painterly approach to drawing goes back to the great 17th century master, Peter Paul Rubens, an artist Wilkie deeply admired and whose drawing of Isabella Brandt, which you see here, Wilkie owned and copied. Wilkie's use of older drawing materials and techniques is characteristic of the approach to drawing that we find in the 19th century, where artists drawn to examples of past art explore past materials and techniques to impart an old masterly look to their work. Another example of the revival of older techniques is this delicate silver point drawing by Joseph Edward Southwell. Silver point, you'll remember, was the medium used by Jan van Eyck in the 15th century. Southwell is associated with the Gothic revival. He was inspired by the writings of John Ruskin and the work of William Morris. His admiration for past art led him not only to experiment with 15th century methods and materials for drawing, but also to champion a revival of tempera painting, a water-based pigment formed with egg white that had been used in medieval illuminated manuscripts. As we observed, metal point is a very unforgiving medium, and Southwell's linear control is extraordinary, producing a rhythmic flow to the hair and the soft and subtle shadows around the eyes, all done through delicate linear lines, linear hatching with silver point. The Victorian period not only saw a revival of earlier media and techniques, but also the use of opaque pigments, or gouache, as a way to generate intense color. This desire for more forceful coloristic effects coincided with the introduction of brilliant new pigments made from opaque compounds such as chromium, cadmium, and barium, and with improvements made to cobalt, zinc, and synthetic iron mixtures. Opaque pigments gave an intensity to the color, together with a density that created a more powerful visual effect, something more akin to that of an oil painting. The use of gouache also encouraged different painting techniques. Gone were the broad, loose washes associated with the transparent technique, replaced instead by tightly controlled applications of paint. And in this respect, William Henry Hunt's study of peaches and grapes is an exceptionally good example of this new approach. And you can see it even better, I think, when you look at this detail. Here, forms are built up from a multitude of small touches made by the tip of the brush. The highlights of the grapes and the fuzz of the peach owe their dusty luminosity to Hunt's use of opaque Chinese white. The combination of glowing transparent watercolor overlaid with small touches of brilliant opaque color creates a powerful three-dimensional effect, and the result is a gem-like study of natural objects. Watercolor landscapes from this period reveal artists employing gouache to give emphasis to certain expressive landscape elements. William Holman Hunt, one of the founders of the Pre-Raphaelite movement and a committed realist, used gouache to suggest blue shadows on green fields in his view of a road over the Sussex Downs. The opaque white touches on the beige paper suggest a chilly gray afternoon in early spring. And we think it's early spring because of these two trees in the back with pink blossoms on them. Another artist associated with realism was John Brett. And John Brett used a combination of watercolor and gouache in this poetic watercolor of boats on an open sea. The white cumulus cloud hovering over the waves was created by using opaque white, which has then been touched with transparent watercolor to create colored modeling. The result is the cloud's striking three-dimensionality, which seems almost out of place in the relatively flat bank of mauve clouds below it, painted in transparent watercolor. Brett also uses white gouache to create the soaring seagull, which you see up here, and also some white touches on the boat in the foreground. One can't help but think these three highlighted objects are meant to be seen in some kind of meaningful communication, perhaps a meditation about fate and hope. The work is a perfect choice for the catalog cover in that it combines many of the materials and techniques we've been discussing, such as transparent watercolor technique for the sky and sea, the use of gouache for visual emphasis, and then the scraping out of highlights on the horizon, which is what you're seeing here. And it's a drawing really that thematizes excursion and imagination. Now, the Victorian period was not only a time of media experimentation, but also the golden age of book illustration. This is related to innovations in printmaking that made it easy and economical to reproduce prints and colored drawings. Several of the artists in this exhibition worked as book illustrators. Richard Doyle, or Dickie as he was known, was a successful illustrator for Punch magazine, and he was also known for his images of the fairy world. His pen and watercolor drawing of the altar cup of Agarup, which features a terrified horse galloping through a dark forest filled with fairies, derives from a Danish legend and appears to have been a favorite subject with him since he made several versions of it. Dickie's brother Charles was the father of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes. Unlike Dickie, Charles struggled unsuccessfully to support himself as an illustrator. In 1881, Charles was institutionalized for alcoholism, and it was during his time in institutions that he created some of his most original art, featuring elves, fairies, and other fantastical themes. His Poison Hemlock, depicting a small, hooded troll-like figure cutting the stem of the deadly plant, comes from a sketchbook from the summer of 1888, when he was confined in a lunatic asylum in Montrose, Scotland. The rambling marginalia on the back of the drawing references the struggles of the Irish politician and nationalist Charles Stewart Parnell. Doyle defends Parnell and then goes on to salute his own genius as an artist and his fondness for the drone of bagpipes and the taste of whiskey, no surprise there, spelt the Irish way, EY, among other things. The watercolor's monochrome blue washes and the sharp pen and ink depictions of the small, furtive figure, the waning or dying moon, and of the plant that brings death, illustrate Doyle's obsession with the fantastic, but also, at this particular time, his fascination with death. The Doyle brothers' fascination with fairies and fairy tales is not an isolated or even mad phenomenon. It can be linked to the Celtic revival at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, and to the rise of Irish nationalism, culminating in the Irish Revolution of 1919. This was a time when all things Celtic, think of Charles Doyle's marginalia, were celebrated by poets like William Butler Yeats and other writers of the Irish literary Renaissance. The Doyle brothers' interest in fairy folk was passed on to their nephew and son, Arthur Conan Doyle. In December of 1920, the author of Sherlock Holmes gave credence to one of the silliest hoaxes of the 20th century when he published the Coddingsley fairy photographs in the Strand magazine. He had been taken in by two little girls who, armed with magazine cutouts and hat pins, staged photographs of themselves with dancing fairies. Conan Doyle reproduced the photographs in the hope, as he said in the accompanying article, the recognition of their existence, fairies, will jolt the material 20th century out of its heavy ruts in the mud and will make it admit there is a glamour and mystery to life. Now, the Doyle brothers' interest in folk tales and Conan Doyle's embrace of the Coddingsley fairies reveals a powerful desire on the part of many to retreat from the Victorian age of steam and mechanized factories into an imaginary world, whether it be a fairy world or we've seen past historical periods like the Middle Ages, but also the world of childhood. The fairy drawings and watercolors of the Doyles are coupled to an explosion in children's literature, which accompanied a revolution in book illustration, which made it possible to reproduce colored drawings. One of the most successful illustrators of children's books was Kate Greenaway. Her sketch of Now All of You Come Listen is a preparatory sketch for a poem in her first book, Under the Window, which you see here on the screen. Greenaway's literature for children melded the Victorian taste for a simpler historical time, in this case Regency England, with a simpler life, childhood, or life stage, childhood. She was famous not just for her elegantly styled representations of children in Regency costume, but also for the fact that in most cases she was illustrating her own stories and poems. And in this sense, she's like that other great woman, author and illustrator of children's books, Beatrix Potter. But what sets Greenaway apart is her abstract sense of design, which we see here, in the way she uses the expanse of the white paper for the verse and the watercolor drawing as a decorative border. The charming and highly stylized illustrations found in Under the Window and her other children's books contrast with Greenaway's natural drawing style, which we see here in her study of an old woman with a basket, which really shows her exceptional grasp of realism. Now, not all British artists turn to the past in an effort to escape the modern world. Selections in the exhibition from the first half of the 20th century reveal an extraordinary range of styles that emerged in Britain towards the end, which emerged in Britain with the turn towards modern abstraction. A large number of artists on view, like David Bomberg, Paul Nash, Gwen John, William Orpen, were trained in drawing at the Slade School of Fine Arts in London by the formidable Henry Tonks. Tonks had trained as a surgeon before becoming an artist and eventually Slade Professor of Fine Arts. His dramatic pastel of a wounded soldier being injected with saline solution was made while he was serving as a medical orderly in the British Red Cross. He became an official war artist for the British Army in 1917. A modest man, Tonks turned down a knighthood and the Slade professorship when it was first offered to him. Modest or not, his intimidating manner made a deep impression on his students. Paul Nash recalled, "Tonks cared nothing for other authorities, and he disliked self-satisfied young men. His surgical eye raked my immature designs. With a hooded stare and sardonic mouth, he hung in the air above me like a tall question mark, moreover of a derisive rather than inquisitive order. In cold, discouraging tones, he welcomed me to the Slade. It was evident he considered that neither the Slade nor I was likely to derive much benefit." We've all had teachers like that. Tonks himself had made the transition from 19th century realism, which is what we see in this pastel, to 20th century abstraction, absorbing as he went French Impressionism, Fauvism, Expressionism, Cubism, and Surrealism. As the exhibition reveals, Tonks's students benefited from his deep formal understanding of this broad range of avant-garde styles. What's remarkable about Tonks's teaching was that he made no effort to control his pupils' graphic expressions. There's no single Tonks look to their productions. As a result, his students encompass a wide range of styles, from William Orpen's realistic graphite study of a young woman that we see here on the left, to Gwen John's flat and abstract rendering of two women seen from behind. Tonks's students, Paul Nash and David Bomberg, both experienced the horrors of World War I and bore psychic scars. Their modern expressionistic tendencies, however, move in very opposite directions. In Nash's graphite study of a dead potted plant on his windowsill, the space of the room has a clean, linear cubist angularity that intersects and contrasts with the drooping curves of the dying plant. Despite its cool and careful arrangement of spatial planes, the drawing is a deeply felt preparatory study for a painting memorializing Nash's beloved father's death. The contrast between the sharp angles of the room and the soft curves of the plant underscores the vulnerability of living things in a hostile environment. The title, Dead Spring, focuses our attention on the plant and its expressive function. Now, David Bomberg's drawing of a Spanish village perched on a hilltop also recalls Cubist fragmentation of form, but now rendered with an intense, even violent, expressionistic handling of charcoal. Now, both works are wonderful examples of how the choice of medium, the silvery fineness of the graphic pencil versus the dark, vigorous charcoal line, telegraphs to the viewer something of the artist's feelings and personality, or at least his chosen graphic persona. So I hope you'll enjoy looking closely and carefully at the drawings on exhibition, not just at their subject matter, but at the way in which they reveal to you how they were made. And I realize you can't look at every drawing on exhibition this way without going mad or blind or both, but try doing it for those that you find most appealing. You know, when you walk into the room, you say, ooh, what's that? And just go over and really look at it. I think, as the most intimate of visual media, drawing invites close looking. And the magical thing is that when you do that, you come to share in the artist's creative process. And I can think of no other visual art that does that so consistently and effectively. And so remember that with drawing, the medium is the message, and the more you look, the more you'll see. So enjoy looking. Thank you.